Saint Benedict in observing that the monk's life should be a continuous Lent. He also observes that few of us have the strength in order to be able to do that, and that's because we really have this tendency due to original sin of turning towards satisfying our own inclinations, our own desires, and Lent gives us a focus time to be able to be mindful of those and relying on God's grace to seek Him and to deny ourselves. As Jesus said, whoever wishes to be my disciple must deny himself daily, take up his cross and follow me. And so from that standpoint, the Church gives us the season of Lent to really focus on that, and Saint Benedict, he established the rule based on a life that is focused on that. So from that standpoint, whereas we have trouble from our human nature to do that continuously, that is the ideal, to look at the consecrated life as the opportunity to turn away from those things that truly cannot satisfy, to deny ourselves of those, which is a sacrifice in itself, but the sacrifice always leads to being more mindful of Christ, and so from that standpoint, I think that's the essence, at least that I take, of why Saint Benedict says that the monk's life should be a continuous Lent. Fasting during Lent, it's interesting. Saint Benedict, in his Tools for Good Works, speaks of one of the tools for good works is that the monk should love fasting. And I remember a number of years ago speaking to my spiritual director saying it, well, I know that fasting is it's a discipline of the Church, but I don't love fasting. And so I brought that to him, and he gave me just this wonderful insight, and I think it relates to the fact of how the monk should not only focus on giving things up in a negative sense, but everything that we do should lead us to Christ. And that was my concern with fasting, that I said, when I would normally fast, I would think about how hungry I was or what I was going to eat when it came time to eat, and so I really wasn't focused on Christ. And he gave me this wonderful insight that we tend to be more mindful of our physical needs than our spiritual needs. And so when I would be fasting and I would sense a physical hunger, just to remind myself and turn to Christ in that and say, oh, Lord, this is how my soul hungers for you. And it almost sounds like a mind game, but I really found it to be very liberating. And from that standpoint, all of our spiritual practices, all of our Lenten practices, really, if we're doing them right, they should lead us closer to Christ. So whether we're fasting from giving up food, whether we're giving up particular habits, giving up media or something like that, it's not a good in itself. I mean, that's not an end in itself. Everything has to be directed towards Christ, and there is a nice complementarity to the traditional practices of fasting, prayer, and almsgiving. So when we take time, even making meals simpler, ideally shorter, that gives us extra time for prayer, and then the prayer, by spending extra time in prayer, we're more mindful of Christ. I find, at least, that oftentimes I tell people I pray a decent amount in terms of just the community prayer and also my own personal prayer, but oftentimes I get answers outside of prayer. But I'm convinced that my time in prayer helps me to be more attentive to the voice of the Good Shepherd, so that when I encounter him elsewhere, then I recognize him. And so just to tie that in with the Lenten practice of almsgiving, and particularly the works of charity, the giving of ourselves, of recognizing Jesus in those who we encounter in need. And so I think the three of them really form a great complementary relationship, and when they're properly ordered, they all help us to be more mindful of Christ and the opportunities to really be present to him as he is present to us throughout each day. Much tougher question, the joy of Lent, and as a matter of fact, one of our priests, Father Kurt Belsol, wrote an STL thesis entitled "The Joy of Lent," and I've read it. It's a wonderful thesis, and I just need to continue to practice it, because truthfully, I really relish every season of the church year, except for Lent. And so when Lent's coming up, I usually cherish a little bit more those last waning days of ordinary time, and I look forward to Easter. And in a certain sense, just by living Lent, there's a nice thing about that. I remember growing up, my grandmother saying, she had a saying that, if you have you have a happy Lent, you're going to have a sad Easter. And at that standpoint, from that, I guess at that time in my life when she would say that, I would recognize it was Lent. I mean, when I go to church on Sunday, and when I hopefully remember to abstain from meat on Fridays, but like most of the Lent, I just wasn't aware of the season. But now I'm much more aware of it, and ideally it's not a season just to try to pass the time to get to Easter, but I guess the joy that I could see is the joy of it is related to the opportunity for joy in Lent is really related to my answer to the last question, that the more that we engage in Lenten practices with the end being of availing ourselves, of opening ourselves, being more mindful of Christ's presence with us by clearing away those things that distract us, by giving of ourselves, by seeking to follow the one who has come to serve, not to be served, but by doing this all in a way that leads us to a greater mindfulness of Christ. He is the one that He's the one that gives us the true joy, and so from that standpoint, I see that's where the opportunity is for Lent to turn away, to do acts of penance out of recognition, as acts of penance for our sins, and ultimately so that we are able to grow in our relationship with Christ. And from that standpoint, that's where Lent provides the opportunity for true joy for all of us. I really can't recall a particular Lent that was good and transforming. Having said that, though, I think as I continue to try to appreciate the season for what it is, the season that the Church gives us, I think each one, and just the way the Lord's worked with me, that in the Magnificat, our Blessed Mother, one of her observations is that He has mercy on those who fear Him in every generation. And I, myself being a later vocation, I really wasn't mindful of the Lord's call to me for a significant part of my life, but I just recognize how He has tended to work with me very patiently, very, very gradually, and I think that's still the case, also the case with Lent, that as I seek to really to focus with the guidance of my spiritual director, and actually with the guidance of Archbishop Douglas as he guides in our community, but by engaging in Lent, I do tend to find Lent's fruitful and just, I guess, to expand on a little bit more of my previous answer on the joy of Lent. Actually, I find myself appreciating the season for what it is, an opportunity to grow closer to Christ. And so, although a particular Lent doesn't stick out to me, I could just say that with each passing Lent, I think by God's grace and with my cooperation, in every passing Lent, I find it to be more of an opportunity in which I have been doing this. So hopefully I will, this next Lent will be even more fruitful than the first, and perhaps at one point in time one will stick out in particular, but I am recognizing it more so as the season of grace that it is, and I'm grateful for that.